Hello, and welcome to the channel. Today's story takes us back to 1998, where in March that year, 23-year-old Amy Lynn Bradley would go missing while cruising on Royal Caribbean International cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas. Over the years, this case has generated many theories, with some believing that this was just a simple case of someone going overboard, while others believe more nefarious acts were at play. I'm going to go over the details surrounding Amy's disappearance, as well as discuss the possible sightings, potential leads as to where Amy may be, and some of the more sickening acts which took place. If you're new here, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you can stay up to date when I post a new video. And so without further ado, let's begin. Amy Lynn Bradley was born on the 12th of May 1974 and lived in Petersburg, Virginia. Her parents were Ron and Ivor Bradley, and she was the eldest of two children. Her younger brother was named Brad. At the time, Amy had just graduated from college and was getting ready to start a new job. She had also recently moved to a new apartment. Her life was slowly falling into place, but she would receive an invitation from her parents to join them and her brother for a once-in-a-lifetime holiday opportunity. Ron, along with several other members of staff, earned a Caribbean cruise holiday through his work, and while this prize only covered the cost for himself and his wife, they decided to pay for their children to join them. Amy was apprehensive at first. Despite being a confident swimmer, as well as being a trained lifeguard, she was known to be fearful of oceans. Despite her concerns, her family managed to convince Amy to join them on the cruise, and a flight was arranged for Amy and Brad to meet their parents in San Juan on the 21st of March 1998. Along with the usual holiday items, Amy packed 15 rolls of film, as she was planning to make a collage for her coffee table. She also sent 2 postcards, one which read, "Hey, it's beautiful here. Old San Juan has got some amazing buildings. I am taking pictures. Maybe you can see them at Easter. Wish you were here, Amy." While the other postcard said, "Hey girl, it's gorgeous here. We leave for Aruba tomorrow. Take care. Tell Madison and Niles hello. I'll be home Saturday at 10. See ya, Amy." Amy had recently adopted a female bulldog that Madison and Niles were caring for, which Amy named Daisy, and she was planning to collect the dog once she returned home from her cruise. By now, the worries Amy had before seemed to evaporate, with excitement replacing her previous feelings. The idea of being surrounded by ocean waters was still an afterthought, but this had been pushed into the back of her mind and replaced with an eagerness to enjoy the experience. However, unbeknownst to everyone, the dream of a happy family holiday would quickly turn into any parent's worst nightmare. The Rhapsody of the Seas is a cruise line vessel, which at the time had not been on open waters for very long. In fact, its maiden voyage only took place on the 19th of May 1997, just under a year prior to Amy and her family boarding the vessel. The 279-metre or 915-foot long ship can hold up to just under 2,500 passengers and possesses 12 decks. Despite being built in France and owned by Royal Caribbean International, who are based in Miami, Florida, the vessel was registered in Oslo, Norway. This was a popular practice of cruise operators at the time, as this avoided complicated regulatory practices, as well as lower or zero tax costs to the company. Although one of the drawbacks of this is that it can complicate criminal investigations. During this time, maritime laws would state that should a crime occur on a vessel while out on international waters, it would fall under the laws and jurisdiction of the nation where the vessel was registered. This meant that many people who travel on cruise liners aren't aware that the laws and rights they're used to experiencing may not apply to them while on board. While I could go into much further detail about this, I think it's important to have an awareness of this now, in preparation for what I'll be explaining later in the video. On the 23rd of March, the cruise liner had departed Aruba and was on its way to Curacao. Before boarding, this picture was taken of the family. On board, the family prepared for an evening of eating, drinking, and dancing. There was a band playing that night called the Blue Orchid, who boarded the vessel earlier to perform for the guests. Amy had caught the attention of several crew, and at one point, while she and Brad were at the casino, a crew member approached the table and asked for Amy by name. He asked her parents whether Amy would be interested in joining him and some of the other crew for drinks off of the ship. When Amy returned, they informed her of this proposal, to which Amy promptly rejected, saying she would absolutely not go with them because the crew gave her the creeps. As the evening progressed, Ron and Ivor retired for the night at around 1 AM, while Amy and Brad continued partying. By now, they had befriended the Blue Orchid band, with Amy seen dancing with the band's frontman, Alister "Yellow" Douglas. Brad returned to the family suite at approximately 3:35 AM, while Amy returned shortly after, about 5 minutes later. This was confirmed due to the ship's electronic logging system, which recorded the times guests entered their rooms, but not the times they left. The pair then set out on the balcony and talked, where Amy mentioned needing to buy cigarettes. Brad would get tired and go to bed, leaving Amy on the balcony. At about 5:30 AM, Ron woke up and saw Amy asleep on the deck chair out on the balcony. Noticing the balcony door was still closed, he fell back to sleep. However, at about 6 AM, Ron woke up again, and this time noticed that the balcony door was open. Amy wasn't there. Her cigarettes and lighter were missing, but her shoes were still on the balcony. Not thinking much of this, Ron assumed that Amy had gone to get a drink and smoke a cigarette, but after Amy failed to return, he immediately suspected something was wrong and left to go to find his daughter. After searching on deck for about an hour, Ron's concerns only grew, and he had no choice but to go back and wake up Ivor and Brad. The Bradley family continued searching for Amy, looking at retracing their steps from the previous night in the hopes she would be found. However, they had no joy. Still unable to find her, and growing ever more worried, they reported her missing to the crew staff. At this time, the ship had already docked at Curacao and was preparing to let passengers off onto the mainland. Ron and Ivor spoke with the ship's security chief, Lou Costello, and begged him not to let anyone off the ship, as well as make a PA announcement and to carry out a full search of the ship. Lou, however, refused this request, believing Amy was likely with another guest on the ship, or that she had already got off the boat to explore Curacao. Ivor continued to beg and plead with the security chief until he eventually relented and agreed to conduct a full search of the ship and place a call on the PA system for Amy to make herself known to the crew staff. By then, however, almost 2,000 passengers were off the boat and freely exploring the island. After Amy failed to respond to the PA announcements, Ivor and Ron got in touch with the ship's captain, Kjetil Gerstad, at around noon, to distribute pictures of Amy across the vessel and to give to other passengers. The captain refused, stating that he didn't see it as appropriate, as he didn't want to cause alarm and distress to the other passengers. The crew weren't that much help either. It was thought many of them believed that Amy had simply left the ship to buy cigarettes, after overhearing Brad stating this to the ship's captain. Predictably, Amy failed to return to the ship, and Gerstad ordered the staff to search all rooms of the cruise ship, and just under 1,000 rooms, restaurants, and facilities. Again, Amy was nowhere to be seen. During the search, Alister Douglas, the bassist for Blue Orchid, also otherwise known as Yellow, approached Brad and told him that he was sorry to hear Amy had gone missing. Brad acknowledged this and continued searching. The Bradley family then took it upon themselves to disembark from the ship and search the island of Curacao for their missing daughter and sister. This would prove extremely difficult though, as they were unable to communicate with the locals, had very little knowledge of the island, and were informed by the captain that they only had a short window of time to search for her, as they would be leaving Curacao, with or without the Bradleys on board. They did all they could in the little time that they had, but by that evening, the ship was about to leave, and they still hadn't found Amy. Left with the difficult decision whether to stay on board or not, they decided to stay on Curacao and continue their search. The Rhapsody of the Seas continued its journey, now 4 Bradleys short. It wasn't long until theories began as to what may have happened to Amy. The first theory came from the ship's senior crew and legal team, stating that Amy had likely fallen overboard in the early hours of the morning, sometime after Amy's father saw her sleeping on the balcony. This made little sense to the Bradleys, as they knew Amy hated the ocean and large waters, and insisted on holding on to someone whenever she was near the rails. Furthermore, the railing on the balcony where the Bradleys were staying was said to be about chest high on Amy, meaning if she did fall overboard, she would have needed to climb onto the rails in order to achieve going over. Her parents outright rejected this theory, again stating how unreasonable it would be for Amy to do this. It was even put to the Bradleys that Amy might have wanted to take her own life, which they vehemently denied was possible, as Amy was a happy young woman with a lot going for her, a new job, new home, new dog. Her life was coming together perfectly. Her postcards even showed that she was planning ahead beyond the holiday. The family just didn't see this as a possibility. Regardless, the idea that Amy may have gone overboard was not an out-of-this-world idea, whether intentional or not. So 24 hours after Amy went missing, a search and rescue operation was carried out on the waters of Curacao, which included assistance from the Dutch Antilles Coast Guard in the form of 3 rescue helicopters. They had also requested a radar plane, a British Navy Royal ship, and help from other smaller cargo and fishing boats. But by the 29th of March 1998, 5 days into Amy's disappearance, the search was called off. Nobody was able to find Amy's body in or floating on the waters. Ron, Ivor, and Brad continued to insist that Amy didn't go overboard, especially denying any possibility that she would have done something like this willingly. They firmly believed that she was still somewhere on the ship, or even worse, had been taken from the vessel against her will. Ron insisted that the balcony door was closed at the time he saw Amy, and opened by the time he woke to find her missing, meaning between 5:30 and 6 a.m, she must have left the room. Proving this would be an issue. As I mentioned earlier, the electronic tagging systems in place for guests only register times for when people entered their rooms, but not when they left them. However, the theory that Amy slipped out was given extra credence when a witness by the name of Crystal Roberts came forward and said that she had seen Amy with a band member walk over and up to the next deck above them. Around 10 minutes later, Crystal said they saw the same band member walking back around, this time by himself. The band member Crystal was referring to was none other than Blue Orchid's bassist, Alister "Yellow" Douglas. Worried that the crew wouldn't take this possible sighting seriously, they visited the American embassy on Curacao, and from there were informed to contact the FBI for their help. Once the Bradleys explained their situation, the FBI agreed to help. However, it would take them 24 hours to get to them. They told Ron and Ivor to travel to St. Martin, the Rhapsody of the Sea's next destination. The boss of the insurance company Ron worked for flew into Curacao and arranged a private flight for himself and the Bradleys to travel to St. Martin, as well as offer his assistance. Once they had arrived, the Bradleys arranged to meet the ship's captain. By now, the Royal Caribbean International captain had company in the form of the cruise liner's legal team. They told the family that the FBI had no jurisdiction on the ship, as it was registered to Norway, meaning the ship was under Curacao and Norwegian laws. The agents had to obtain permission from the company itself before they were allowed to conduct an investigation on the ship. After much negotiation, 2 agents were allowed to board, although they had to be plain-clothed so as not to disturb or distress the guests on board. By now, rumours were running rife on the Rhapsody of the Seas, with many talking about someone going overboard, possibly wanting to end their own life. Regardless, the FBI got to work investigating. First, they checked Amy's cabin and discovered her ID was still there, indicating that she was planning to return to the cabin. They also discovered that the initial search that the ship's staff was said to have carried out was nowhere near as thorough as they first thought. It transpired Gerstad had instructed the crew only to search the common areas and crew quarters, as he didn't want to disrupt the other guests. After learning this, Ron and Ivor were furious, and understandably so. If it was the case that Amy was somewhere else other than these areas at the time she disappeared, then it stood to reason that the crew failed to locate her at such a crucial stage of her going missing. The FBI agents then decided to carry out a full and thorough search of the ship, but found no trace of Amy. Ron, Ivor, and Bradley had no choice but to travel back to Curacao to continue their search. On the 28th of March 1998, one day before the search of the waters had concluded, the Bradley family would travel back to America without Amy. At the time, the Bradleys were convinced that Amy hadn't gone overboard, as they knew how frightened she was of the oceans and how her life was back at home. They believed that someone on board the ship, possibly a crew member, was involved, but the Royal Caribbean International's apparent desperation to minimise any reputational damage saw their efforts hampered. Meanwhile, Royal Caribbean International's stance was that this was an unfortunate case of someone going overboard, whether it was a drunken accident or a case of suicide. A spokesperson claimed that while the FBI was investigating the Bradleys' cabin, the furniture had been rearranged against the railing, with footprints found on the rails. However, the FBI failed to corroborate or refute these claims, stating they wouldn't disclose this to Royal Caribbean International staff, but they wouldn't deny it either. So what exactly happened? While we can't say exactly for sure, what I will go through next demonstrates that what I've said before is only the tip of the iceberg. Before looking into possible sightings of Amy, it's important to talk about the role Alister Douglas played in this case. Based on the eyewitness account of Crystal Roberts, Yellow was the last person to be seen alive with Amy, making him the FBI's main person of interest. On the night of Amy's disappearance, Yella was dancing with Amy. Brad would say that, quote, "She said that when they were dancing at the disco, he tried to, dance a little too close, and she had to tell him to back off a little bit." Additionally, Brad had also realised that at the time Alister approached him to offer his sympathies, he shouldn't have been aware of this, as only he, his parents, the ship's security chief, and captain were the only ones who knew Amy was missing. Alister was brought in for questioning, where he explained that he and Amy were dancing in the Viking nightclub that night, but she had no other interest in him, and the pair eventually parted ways. He denied being with Amy at the time Crystal said she saw the pair. He would take a polygraph test, which would come back inconclusive, but as there was no evidence tying him directly to Amy's disappearance, he would be released without charge. Ron and Ivor listened to the interrogation from behind a two-way mirror. As Alister left, he saw Ron and Ivor and turned to them, smiled, and put up two thumbs. It was said at the time of him doing this, Ron wanted to punch him there and then. Besides Alister, there were also other things that didn't sit well with the Bradleys. The first being the waiters on the ship, in particular the one who asked for Amy by name. After she disappeared, Ivor began to look at this interaction with him in a new light. She remembered Amy saying the staff gave her the creeps and that she wouldn't do anything with them. Not only this, but they started to believe that perhaps this crew member was trying to coerce Amy off of the ship for nefarious purposes. Ivor would say, quote, "Amy would have been a trophy. Amy would have been someone that, I believe, could have been picked out and fingered to move off of that ship. She could have been held and hidden. She could have been possibly drugged and taken from that ship." This theory gained further traction after it was discovered that on the night of Amy's disappearance, a photographer was hired by Royal Caribbean to take pictures of the passengers on board. He would then put these pictures on a board for the passengers to come and view. However, when the Bradleys went to look at their pictures, they found all but Amy's pictures were there. They asked the photographer where Amy's pictures were, to which he confirmed that he had definitely printed them, meaning that someone had taken the pictures of Amy from the board. It's theorized that they were taken to show prospective buyers. Once the family returned home, they set up a 24-hour hotline for people to call in with leads. It wouldn't take long until the phone began ringing. A couple of days after the phone line was set up, the Bradleys received a phone call from a taxi driver from Curacao, who informed them that he had been approached by a woman who may have been Amy on the day that she vanished. He said that she asked if he had a phone that she could borrow, but she quickly ran away. The taxi driver recalled remembering her green eyes. Another man, a Puerto Rican police cadet, would tell of a time where he saw a woman being forcibly placed into a taxi by a strange man in a hat. In fact, while the family were in Curacao searching for Amy, 4 days into the search, Brad claimed to have heard Amy from inside a van. He gave chase and eventually caught up with the van, but there was no sign of Amy, just a lone driver. Brad to this day was unsure if he had chased down the wrong van, or whether his mind was playing games with him. There wouldn't be any further developments until 5 months after Amy had vanished, where the family were contacted by a Canadian man, David Carmichael. David was at home watching TV, where he saw a show providing coverage on the Amy Lynn Bradley case. This triggered a memory in David's mind. A few months earlier, he had been in Curacao with friends, when one day where he was on the beach, he noticed a woman walking alongside 2 men, a black man and a white man. According to David, The woman seemed to notice David speaking in English and turned sharply towards him. She began to make her way over to him, where she was stopped and taken away by the men. According to David, the black man then turned to him and gave him a menacing look as if to say, "Don't speak to this woman." This woman, David said, was Amy Lynn Bradley. She had tattoos which matched those Amy had: a Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, the sun on her back, a Chinese symbol on her right ankle, and a lizard found on her navel. The FBI would follow up on this lead, but by this time, it was too little, too late. The lead went cold. The next reported sighting wouldn't take place until the following year, when in 1999, an ex-American Navy officer claimed to have spoken to Amy while he was drinking in a brothel. While there, he claimed that a woman approached him and asked for his help, telling the man she was an American woman who was stuck and needed to get home. The officer explained to her to go to an American embassy, as well as informing her where his ship was docked, but she explained that this was impossible due to her papers being seized by her kidnappers. A quick note: Amy's papers were actually still on board the Rhapsody of the Seas at the time, so it's unclear why she would think this. Regardless, the officer failed to do anything and left the brothel. Add to that, he didn't come forward until 3 years later, in 2002, as at the time he was concerned about losing his Navy role if his superiors learned he had visited a brothel, and said nothing until he was discharged. He provided information on where to find the brothel, but unfortunately for authorities who were investigating, the premises had long since burned down, leaving no clues for anyone to work with. But perhaps the biggest and most promising sighting occurred when the Bradleys were contacted by a man named Frank Jones, who not only said he knew where Amy was, but that he could rescue her and bring her home. Frank Jones was a former US Army Special Forces officer turned gun for hire, who had been looking into the Amy Lynn Bradley case, where he caught wind of a lead. A woman by the name of Judith Margaretha said that she knew where Amy was. She described Amy in detail, right down to her tattoos, and even hummed a lullaby that Amy would have heard as a child, sang to her by Ivor. This was enough to convince Ron and Ivor that this lead was genuine. Margaretha told Ron and Ivor that she had seen Amy regularly grocery shopping, as well as at her local gym. She would say that Amy would often be with a man with long, blonde hair and a sleeve tattoo on one arm. She also told Ron and Ivor that Amy was being kept in a housing complex surrounded by barbed wire, which was heavily protected by armed Colombian guards. The family agreed for Jones to scout the area Judith described, and he recruited a team of ex-Army Rangers and ex-Navy SEALs to travel to Curacao to check out this lead and report their findings. They set up surveillance points around the complex and began watching and reporting back. It was reported that Amy had been seen alongside this blonde-haired man in a dark green SUV. In the report, it stated that Amy was in a dangerous situation, and the surveillance team even had to flee the island after a week, as they had been spotted and shot at by around 10 men. Despite this setback, Jones committed more men to the island and carried on reporting back to the family over the next few months. This operation would come at a cost. In total, the family had paid almost $25,000 to Jones, as well as receiving donations of over $186,000 from the nation's Missing Children organization, a charity which was set up to help families like Ron and Ivor's find their children. They had set up a specific fund for Amy's case, and it was these funds that were used to help pay Jones's costs. Eventually, Jones reported that the situation was becoming extremely dangerous for Amy, and it was feared that she may be executed. Therefore, the time had come to rescue her. But before he could do that, he needed more money to finance the rescue mission. But before Ron and Ivor agreed, they demanded to see proof that Amy was still alive. Happy to oblige, Jones sent them a picture of two people, a man and a woman at the beach, facing away from the camera. The picture showed a woman whose tattoos matched that of Amy's, and a man who had long blonde hair. Ron and Ivor were convinced that it was Amy, with Ivor saying, quote, "When I got the pictures, I knew Amy was okay, and it was just a matter of time." The family travelled to Florida and waited in a hotel, with Ron's boss hiring a private jet ready to take them to Curacao upon confirmation that the mission was complete. However, as the days came and went, no calls came. On the island of Curacao, one of the men tasked with watching the complex, Tim Buckholtz, overheard one of Jones's conversations with the Bradleys, updating them on Amy's movements and the Colombian gang who were keeping her against her will. However, Tim was one of the men watching the home, and what Jones was saying didn't add up. During this time surveillancing the home, he never spotted anything out of the norm. The people he was watching were just ordinary people. No barbed wire fencing, no armed Colombian guards, no blonde-haired man, and no Amy. It was at this point Tim realised that Frank Jones had been lying to the Bradleys for months. He would immediately contact the Bradleys and tell them the truth about the situation. The truth was that Frank Jones was never a serving officer in the Special Forces. In fact, he had never seen Amy on the island. He had somehow managed to convince genuine ex-officers to partake in a surveillance operation, when in fact the whole thing was an elaborate con, set up by him and a couple of his acquaintances. This meant the picture of Amy that convinced even Ron and Ivor was also a fake. One of Jones's team members, Jono Senk, would later admit to being the man in the image, where he donned a blonde wig, and the woman was another acquaintance who sported temporary tattoos to trick the Bradleys into believing she was their daughter. The beach wasn't even at Curacao, but in Pensacola, according to Senk. Frank Jones would later be arrested and charged with mail fraud. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and was ordered to pay back the money he conned from the Bradleys and the nation's missing children organisation. Judith Margaretha was also later found out to be a fraud. Her own son Giovanni would say, quote, "It's a lie. It's just using Amy's mother as a way of stealing." Judith denied lying, but also said that, quote, "Maybe I'm a bad person, but with all my badness, I want Mrs. Bradley really to find her girl." She ended up pocketing $8,000 as a result of the information she gave to the Bradleys. The pair were utterly devastated, but so desperate were they to find their daughter, they were prepared to put their trust in almost anyone. Ron Bradley would later say of this experience that, quote, "If there's a chance, what else do you do? If it was your child, what would you do? So I guess we took a chance, and I guess we lost." "2005 saw a couple of notable events, the first taking place in Barbados, where an American tourist named Judy Mora claimed to have seen Amy in a department store toilet. There, she witnessed a woman enter, along with 3 men. The men proceeded to threaten Amy over a potential deal they had made, telling her that she had no choice but to follow through with this deal. After the men left, Judy approached the woman to check on her. Judy said that the upset woman turned to her and said that her name was Amy and that she was from Virginia. But before she could say any more, the men re-entered and took her away. Judy reported this to the authorities, but again this led nowhere. She was, however, able to assist in helping authorities create composite sketches of the people there that day. Then, again in 2005, the Bradleys received an anonymous email providing pictures of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Amy. The sender claimed that the images were from a Caribbean website which advertised sex workers. The woman in the pictures was named Jazz, and he showed her in various stages of undress. The family sent these to the FBI for further examination. After being looked at by several experts, they concluded that the images were of Amy, with one expert saying that he would bet his whole career on it being her. Unfortunately, like all other leads, this was as far as it went, as the FBI were unable to trace the origin of the photos, and again the case went cold. To this day, there have been no other sightings of Amy Lynn Bradley, although in 2010, her name would be brought up again after a jawbone containing a single wisdom tooth was discovered washed up on a beach in Aruba. The jawbone was tested, and it was determined to have belonged to a human Caucasian female. However, further tests revealed that it didn't belong to Amy, nor did it belong to Natalie Holloway, who was also another high-profile missing persons case at the time. And so that's where we are with this case. Ron and Ivor continue to search for their daughter and have made several TV appearances in the years since her disappearance in order to keep the case alive. The FBI are also still investigating this, and in 2018, they released aged progressed photos showing what Amy may look like today. They ask anyone with any potential information to come forward and contact them. There is still a $250,000 reward that the family are offering for information leading to Amy's return, as well as a $50,000 reward for information leading to a verifiable location. The FBI have also posted a $25,000 reward for information leading to her recovery. Thank you for watching the video. I'm really intrigued to know what you think happened to Amy. Was this a case where Occam's razor can best explain this? Or was this a case of a more sinister nature? Personally, I can't ignore the number of sightings in the years since she vanished. Although with such a large reward on offer, it's equally important to note that some may be after this rather than the truth, as was the case for Frank Jones. So please leave your thoughts in the comments section below, and consider liking this if you found this video informative. Please also consider subscribing to the channel, as well as hitting the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Again, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care and goodbye for now.